I think the last time I was here was quite a lot of years ago when we were doing the drones work in Waziristan. But it's a great pleasure to be back again. I've got to forewarn you that because my name's Clive and therefore the Indian subcontinent hates me sometimes because of Robert Clive, I'm feeling terribly unwell. So please forgive me if I suddenly dash out of here. It's nothing you said. I would really appreciate if you interrupt at any moment. It's much more fun having a discussion when you do that. You know, you can interrupt, you can throw things, I don't care what you do. That's much more enjoyable. So look, what I thought we'd talk about today is we'll start by talking about my mother. My mother, bless her, died about a month ago. And she was the one who told me when I was a young child that my duty as a privileged, or what I prefer to call an old privileged white male, is to help those who are less fortunate than us around the world. And that's a principle that certainly ruled my life. And of course it's a principle that should rule yours as well. And I'm just trying to look for the picture here that Farouk, here we go. This is what my mother's talking about. I'm just going to pass that around, if you would, pass it along. I want you all to look at that picture and know that that's what we're talking about here today. We're talking about Aafia Siddiqui, and that little baby in her hands is Sulaiman, who was just a few months old when Aafia was kidnapped by your government on behalf of my government, the American government. I've got two governments, the British and American. I get to apologize for lots of things. But she was kidnapped with that little child and her two other children. And how many of you people, I mean, there's some young folk here, right? I pretend I'm still 23, it's not true. How many of you have got children? Yeah, come on, put your hands up. So let me ask you, can you tell me about your children? You, sir, yeah.
I've got one daughter.
One daughter, how old is she?
She's around 18.
If you're, and what's her name, may I ask?
Ayla.
Okay, if Ayla was taken from you when she was a very small infant and killed, how would you feel about that?
Of course, I'll feel bad.
Let's take, because the second child that Aafia had was Mariam, who was only 3 years old at the time. Now, if Ayla was taken from you at age 3 and snatched from you and then forcibly fostered into an American family for 5 years and you had no idea where she was, how would you feel about that?
Of course, I'll feel bad, obviously.
How psychologically damaged do you think you would be at this point?
It will be quite, obviously, it will be damaging.
Okay, well let's
if
take
you don't know where your child is for 5 years, obviously.
Well, let's take the third child, who is Mohammed, who was 5, who was abducted at the same time and for 5 years was subjected to all sorts of terrible things himself. Let's say Ayla was taken from you and you didn't know where she was, and she was 5 years old, and for 5 years she was being abused. What do you reckon now? I mean, I'm giving you 3 kids now, so this is what we're talking about. And when I saw Aafia, and I'll tell you a bit about it in a while, but when I saw Aafia in January of this year, I'd just come from Guantanamo Bay, and I have had the immense privilege of representing 87 prisoners in Guantanamo. And I'll tell you this, that Aafia Siddiqui has been subjected to far worse things than any of the prisoners that I represented in Guantanamo Bay. And as a result, she's far more psychologically traumatized, inevitably. I've got one son. I've got a son, Wilf, who's 14. And I know I would have rather more dramatic answers than our friend here.
Yeah, last time when you came here, you started with your
presentation
with his picture.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
I remember, you said when I'll display it, you'll say, oh.
I didn't do that to you, did I? I do tend to do that. I show pictures of Wilf because he is the apple of my eye. and lovely kid. And the idea of anything happening to him is horrific. And I don't know what would happen to me or my wife if someone did these things to my child. But there's another important point about Guantanamo Bay, which is this. How many of you here honestly, ignoring the fact that I'll probably come and slap you about a bit, how many of you honestly in your hearts think, oh, that Aafia Siddiqui, maybe she was involved in some bad things. We've heard that she was in 𝐒𝐚𝐿 or whatever. How many of you honestly believe maybe some of that's true? Come on, be honest. It's okay, you can admit to it. I'm going to tell you exactly how you're wrong, but you can admit to it.
I don't think that someone believes it, but there are questions.
There are questions.
Yeah.
There are always questions.
And definitely when you say that she has been subjected to things that others have not experienced, this adds to that question, why?
Yeah, of course
Why
it does.
Yeah.
Because, it's bizarre, but you lot probably think that we as Americans, or you probably did think 20 years ago, that we as Americans wouldn't do this crazy stuff without some reason. Because we like to think that we have a reputation for human rights and so forth. And, it's actually, I haven't been doing this for 20 years, I've been doing it for 39 years. And for the first 20 years, pretty much all I did was represent people on death row in America. And those were the people we hated back then. And we always thought that these were terrible, dreadful people. Now, in Guantanamo Bay, we announced to the world that the people in Guantanamo were the worst of the worst terrorists in the world. That was a direct quote from Donald Rumsfeld. And when I filed the very first lawsuit against Guantanamo Bay, which was February the 19th, 2002, honestly, I thought, they're going to make mistakes because the government always does, but probably most of those people down in Guantanamo were captured on the battlefield of Afghanistan. And when I finally get in to see them, I'm going to have some explaining to do. But for me, it was a matter of principle that we just don't say that we're going to lock people up without trial. But when we finally got in there, and I'll tell you, the first night when we sued them, I went on Fox television, right? Because I didn't ever go on American TV, I never watched American TV, and I didn't know how bad Fox television was. And for representing these people, in a 5-minute interview, I was accused of being a traitor to the United States 5 times. And that night, even though I had an unlisted phone number, I got all sorts of fabulous death threats. Because people were really bent out of shape about 9/11, and that's understandable. But I thought when I got to Guantanamo Bay, there'd be a lot of people there who really were fighting in Afghanistan. Now, quite what business of America that is, I don't know. My position was, so what? I wouldn't go fighting anywhere, but it's none of my business what these people do. But I got down to Guantanamo when we won in the United States Supreme Court, and goodness knows I had a hard time finding an honest-to-goodness terrorist. I was meeting all of the people. I've represented way more people in Guantanamo than anyone else. And I had a terribly hard time finding anyone who had anything to do with Al-Qaeda. And do you know where the majority of the prisoners in Guantanamo came from? Where do you reckon? Where were they captured on the battlefield? What do you reckon? No, it was Karachi. Karachi, which I looked on the map, you do that Google thing, it's exactly 1,000 kilometers from the battlefield in Afghanistan. And you know why they were captured in Karachi? That was your dear President Musharraf. And if you read his book, In the Line of Fire, which I strongly advise you not to, it's a terribly boring book, but if you go to page 244, you'll see right there that he boasts, when he's criticized because he says people say he's not doing enough to support America, he says, how dare they say that? We have sold the majority of the prisoners in Guantanamo to the Americans for bounties, for money, which we, the government, have taken. Now, the Americans got upset about that. They weren't upset that he said they'd paid bounties. The Americans were upset that they'd put it in their pockets, as usual, because the money was meant to go to the people who turned folk in. Now, look to the person on your right, everyone, look to the person on your right. I'm offering you $250,000 to tell me that that chap on your right was in Tora Bora in 2001 October. I'm going to give you $250,000 if you say that.
Yeah, I can do that for Altaf.
You're going to do that. Well, I'm going to reach over there and do it for Altaf myself. We're all going to take money for Altaf. Come on, honestly, who's going to... Seriously, who would do that? $250,000 I'm giving you. You know, you could pick some nice young person who probably was an infant at the time and snitch on him. This is what we were doing. And I've got a number of people who are looking a little shifty over here who are going to take the money. Now, you know, you said, sorry, I'm pointing you, right? To your right is a woman, right? No, you. Yeah. So you could probably snitch on her, thinking she's young enough that she couldn't really have been in Al-Qaeda in 2001. May I ask you how old you are or not? Is that very rude? Yeah.
23.
23. So she would have been 2, and she was a woman, and you could collect $250,000 by snitching on her, right? And you think, no one's going to put her in Guantanamo Bay, but I can pocket $250,000. Are you going to do it? You can even give her half of it. You can give her $125,000 later.
Of course not.
Of course you are. Okay, look, this is the problem. So when I first learned about that, you know, finally the penny dropped. I've got a bunch of the flyers that we Americans dropped all over the place in Afghanistan, Pakistan, that has a picture of a bearded Muslim male who looks awfully like Abu Imran. Do you remember Abu Imran? So this is Saifullah Paracha, who is one of my dear friends, and he's my boss, aren't you, Saifullah, who was in Guantanamo Bay, and it was my privilege to represent him there. And I'm going to use you as an exhibit in a minute, Saifullah, don't worry. Yeah, come on up here. So this is when I was going around all the prisoners in Guantanamo, this began to explain why all of these nobodies were there. Now, and I'm saying this because we're going to get to what happened to Aafia, because there have been 780 prisoners in Guantanamo. For us to get any prisoner out of Guantanamo, all 6 of the top intelligence agencies in America, the CIA, the FBI, the NSC, all of them, have to say this person's no threat to anyone, right? And so far we've got 750 people out of Guantanamo, and we've got another 14 who we've cleared. So that's 764 out of 780 people in Guantanamo have been cleared for release. Now, which of you mathematicians is going to tell me what percentage of Guantanamo Bay that is? Come on, what is it? Yeah, roughly, you don't have to tell me. No, don't go calculate. Get your thing out. It's 98.5%, right? So 98.5% of the people in Guantanamo, according to the American government themselves, were the wrong people. And that was because we were doing it for money. Then we would torture people, and they would admit to things because they were under torture. And, you know, this went on and on and on. But when I was last flying to Guantanamo in January, I was talking to the stewardess on British Airways. And I said to her, how would you feel if your planes ended up going to the wrong airport 98.5% of the time? How many people do you think would fly on British Airways if they got it wrong 98.5% of the time? It's truly shocking how wrong we've been. And it's because we were in such a panic after 9/11. Now, let's get on to Aafia. Because for those of you who have, you know, some of you probably think Aafia is an American citizen, right? Total nonsense. I don't know where they got that one from. Some of you, you know, I saw this thing yesterday where this guy was saying Aafia is dead. Aafia is dead. Well, that's not true. I saw her the other day. Neither is all the nonsense they say. They say she was married to Aamir al-Baluchi. That's unbelievable nonsense. I've talked to Amar's lawyers in Guantanamo. It just didn't happen. Now, the question is, why did all of this stuff get said about her? And the answer is, first, $25,000 was what she got sold for as a bounty, which is relatively cheaper.
55,000.
Maybe 55. Well, we'll see. But for Saifullah, we think he's worth quite a lot too. This is not a joke. It's horrendous what we did. But then one of the things I learned quite recently about Aafia was exactly what I just said to this gentleman who's leaving the room right now, which is that some of the men who were being interrogated under torture get shown photographs, get asked questions about people, and they got to make up a story about someone because they got to stop the torture. And one of them actually said to me that he starts saying things about Aafia because he thought that, well, they're not going to do anything to a woman, right? We can safely point to her because surely no one's going to lock her up in Guantanamo. So this is the way that all this nonsense comes about. And I'm here to tell you that Aafia is no more a member of Al-Qaeda than I am. Yeah, right, okay. The information about her being extremist is just nonsense. But so what? Even if it was all true, we don't take her off, kill one of her children, torture the other next to, and torture her for 5 years in Bagram Air Force Base, and then the things that happened to her afterwards, which we'll discuss. So first I just wanted to dispel that notion. It's just nonsense. And also we all agree that people are innocent until proven guilty, in theory. I realize that doesn't always apply. But she's never been charged with being a member of Al-Qaeda. If the Americans thought they could prove it, they would have done it. And they didn't. And so let's put that aside. Now let's talk about who she really is. Because this is where your duty comes in, right? I'm trying to do my bit. And the reason I do it is partly because my mum told me to, but it's partly because my country is to blame. Above even Musharraf and them for turning her in, it's America that's done these things to Aafia. And I do all of this for free, for nothing, because how can anyone possibly pay an American lawyer, right? I went to law school at Columbia Law School, where my friends who ended up as corporate lawyers and all that stuff are now charging $1,500 an hour. If you have a cup of coffee with those people, it just cost you $500. So no one in Guantanamo, no one in Aafia's situation can possibly afford to have a real lawyer. So it's just, that's why I had to do it for free, because otherwise my mother would be very annoyed at me. But, we've got to do our part in America, but you people in Pakistan have to do your part for reasons we'll discuss in some depth, because a lot of the problems come from here and not from the US, even though the US is responsible for many things too. So, anyway, I only got involved in Aafia's case in January, and I'm sorry about that. I wish I'd been involved in 2008, 2010, because then I don't think she'd be there. But I got involved. I've been really busy with some of your other citizens, all this chap over here, trying to get him out. And if I didn't do as Saifullah told me, I was in big trouble too, isn't that right? Yeah. So when Saifullah came home in October, and then Ahmed and Abdul Rabbani came home early this year, I felt I had a little extra time. So when Fawzia was doing what Fawzia does best, which is, oh, hi, Imran. Good morning. So when Fawzia was asking me to go see her sister, I was in Guantanamo Bay at the time. I was going to Texas for a death penalty case I have there. And so why not? I'm there. I can just try and stop in. Now, it's not easy to get into FMC Carswell, which is where Aafia is. And FMC Carswell should tell you something. FMC means Federal Medical Center. Now, that tells you that the Americans think, at least, that Aafia needs psychological care, which of course she does. The thing it doesn't tell you is that actually FMC Carswell is a maximum security prison. It's a god-awful place. They don't give her any medical care at all, and she is in a terrible situation even now. So even after we've put her through 5 years of torture in Bagram and all sorts of other stuff after that, we're not treating her well at all. But when I went to see her, I got in there eventually. They're the most inefficient people in the world. I mean, goodness knows how America ever wins a war. But I got in and I talked to her for an hour and a half. And Aafia, first she's obviously gone through terrible physical trauma. She's lost all her bottom teeth, which were knocked out in an incident in the prison. And they haven't given her dentures, for goodness sake. But that's the least of her problems, really. She is more traumatized, I would say, than any person I've ever met in Guantanamo, and almost any person. There's probably one or two who are almost there of the 400 people I've met on death row, who I've represented. So she's in a horrendous situation in terms of mental health. Now, I say that, and I want you to understand this very clearly. I don't say that because it changes her humanity. She's still a very intelligent woman who I had, she did most of the talking, not me. My father was a very intelligent man. He got a double first at Cambridge, but he was profoundly psychotic a lot of his life. It's not his fault. And Aafia didn't have any real idea as to why she's in prison. She has no real idea as to where she's in prison. And this is because of what we've done to her. And she certainly doesn't think she should be in prison. And so it was very, very traumatic for me to see her, although obviously nothing compared to her. And, at that point, there's nothing Fawzia could say to stop me from helping her sister. But, this is where we are. We've got this woman who's being treated horribly in an American prison, and if she was in Guantanamo, I could get her out pretty quickly. And so the question is, what do we do with her there? And so let's talk about why she's there. In Guantanamo, no one got a trial, and everyone thought that was awful, and so that was a big argument for letting him out. Aafia's had a trial, and people say, oh, she's had a trial, so she must be guilty of something. I'm going to tell you what she's charged with. I mean, when I read this, I thought, oh my goodness, I've done hundreds of these cases, and I've never seen such nonsense. So they say, the American government says, that she was in Ghazni, and she was wandering around Afghanistan. They try to make out like that was something bad. This is what really happened. She was in Bagram for 5 years. We know that's true, but some of my Guantanamo clients heard her screaming there. She was then dumped back in Pakistan, totally traumatized by the torture she'd been through in Bagram, terrified that the Pakistan government was going to do what they did before and turn her over to someone more. So she fled to Afghanistan, hoping that that was a safe haven in her traumatized state. Now, what the US says is that she was arrested in Afghanistan. They've never actually told us quite why. Why do you arrest this woman who you just tortured for 5 years? But they say she was in custody and that she wasn't handcuffed. Well, that's not true, right? That's a lie. There's never in the history of humanity, in those circumstances, or in humanity, been an American prisoner who we didn't have in handcuffs. How many times, Saifullah, did they let you wander around? You were treated better than most people because you're such basically a nice guy, and you were the oldest prisoner in Guantanamo. But how often would they let you wander around the prison without any shackles?
I don't remember any moment that I was not shackled. I was shackled sometime from my back, which was very uncomfortable. It reminded me several occasions where they kept us handcuffed along the fence even. Mm-hmm. They put the handcuff with the fence and gone. And we needed to use the toilet, and nobody was around.
So that's your answer, right?
And a handcuff, leg cuffs, and even hood.
Right, so it's just not going to happen. There is no way on God's good earth that she was there without handcuffs on. So they're lying about that, obviously.
When
Now-
I had my heart problem, heart attack, I was kept in a ICU, an intensive care unit, and I was shackled my both hand and legs to the bed.
When he finally got back here and he had his operation for his heart that he really needed here, Saifullah sent me a picture of his ankles saying, hey, they don't shackle prisoners in hospital here in Pakistan. Now, let me ask you another question, Saifullah. How many times in your time in American custody did a guard leave you without handcuffs and just leave his M16 down next to you?
Never.
Of course not. This is what they say happened, that they say this guard left his M16 down next to Aafia, right? Now, and then they say she grabbed it to start, the shootout at the 𝐒𝐚𝐿 and shoot her way out of there. If they ever had left a gun next to you in Guantanamo where you're surrounded by guards with guns and stuff, would you have grabbed it and started shooting?
Never.
Of course not, because who's going to get shot?
Yeah. And
Who would have got shot?
Another thing is when they put me on a ICU with all my limbs tied to the bed, and the cardiologist shouted at them that we're trying to save his life and you're killing him. He needs movement. Then they served me the breakfast, first the dinner. I refused to take because they said, we cannot remove the shackle from your hand. I said, I can't eat with the shackles. So I refused to eat.
Right.
And they were begging me to eat. They wanted me to live,
Yeah.
not to die.
Well, some people
And
did.
then in the morning, they changed the rule. They let me have my handcuff removed, and I ate.
So look, Aafia Siddiqui was not, if she had in this miraculous circumstance of not having handcuffs and having an M16, she's not going to start shooting because who's going to get shot? She's going to get shot. And sure enough, that's what happened, and she was shot. So let's all agree that the charge against her in the Southern District of New York, which was attempted murder of a federal official, the legal term, if you'll forgive me for saying on camera, is total bullshit. And, it just didn't happen. Now, I don't know for sure yet. I've only been involved in this for too short a time. But I think I have a pretty good idea what happened, and we're going to have to see. And my plan was to go, I'm not sure I'll be able to do it on this trip, but I was going to go to Afghanistan the day after tomorrow to go investigate, because now at least we can do that, because the Americans are not in charge, and so we can talk to people. But I think what happened, from what I've heard and what makes sense to me, is, poor Aafia is stumbling around Afghanistan and comes up to a checkpoint, and because she's obviously disturbed because of everything she's been through, they think she's a suicide bomber. So they shoot her. Now, then they discover that she's not. Oh no, my goodness, we've got to make up a story. I suspect that's what happened, but I can't prove that yet. We'll have to see. But anyway, regardless, she gets dragged halfway around the world to be tried in New York. Why? Whatever crime they say happened in Afghanistan. It didn't happen in New York. What right do we have as America, even though we think we're the world's policemen, to take her thousands of miles to New York City? Now, the Southern District of New York, you may think, is a serious court. I'm here to tell you it's not. And I've tried a lot of cases in America, and if you think it's bad that 98.5% of prisoners were not who they said they were in Guantanamo, the conviction rate in the SDNY is 99.5%. One person out of every 200 gets found not guilty in the SDNY, and that's because of the way federal courts operate. She wasn't allowed to present evidence of all her abuse and her torture. She's charged with this, offense against a federal officer, supposedly. The only people who can say they saw it were federal officers. They're going to say what they're going to say. So it's, the words of several federal officers against her. She's going to get convicted, of course she is. But it doesn't mean she did it. And at the same time, they give her 86 years in prison. Now, it's for an attempt supposedly to shoot a federal officer. She's the one who gets shot, and they give her 86 years in prison. Ugh. And we do this in America. I had a client once who was given, I think it was 400 consecutive life sentences. We do believe in reincarnation in America. We think that we can sentence you to these absurd sentences, and maybe you'll come back and we can... It was Ted Bundy I met once. I think he was sentenced to death several times. So we could execute him a few times. It's just crazy, crazy. So she's doing 86 years, and she's going to die in prison in America unless we all do something about it. Now, what are we going to do? Well, it's not that hard to see what we're going to do. It's a bit harder to get it to happen. The first thing you have to recognize is legally, a lot of her first rights are gone, long since gone. It's very hard to get someone out of prison on a habeas corpus application now under American law, because you can't even bring a second challenge to it without proving that no reasonable person, unfortunately that means no reasonable, probably white American person, would find her guilty. So it's a tough standard. We're going to have to try and do that, certainly. There are other legal avenues. There's a right to be released for compassionate grounds. You have to ask yourself just how much compassion we have as Americans, but we'll certainly be trying that. We can seek a pardon. We can seek various different things. But actually the way it really works is not that way. In Guantanamo Bay, there have been, as I say, 750 people who are no longer in there. There's been one person who's been ordered released by a court of law. One. And I'm proud to say it was one of my clients, so I'm taking credit for that. Pride, I know, is a deadly sin. But I only say that because 749 were not released because of a court. Safullah was not released because of a court, it was because of the court of public opinion. And my job over the last 20 years has been to go into Guantanamo to get the truth out, which is not easy because everything's classified and secret, but to get the truth out and then publish it to the world to embarrass the heck out of the American government, and then finally they let people go. The court of public opinion is incredibly powerful. How many of you are journalists here? Anyone a journalist? Oh, you should be. You should all be journalists. You're writing a book. You're a journalist. Everyone who writes stuff is a journalist. I view my job as partly going to court and partly going to the court of public opinion and partly coming to talk to you, because this is how we're going to get her out. Now, right now, the people who need to act, not the Americans, they're the Pakistan government. And we met with the Foreign Office yesterday, and they've got a lot of work to do. And there are various things they need to do. First, we need to do some human things. You must never forget that this is a case about Aafia Siddiqui, who is a human being who needs us to be there for her. So we're trying to get Fawzia in. We will get Fawzia in at the end of this month to see her sister. And, that takes a little bit of work, not just to get her the visas, which we finally got, but also poor Fawzia. Aafia told me she didn't want Fawzia coming because Aafia is convinced that Fawzia is going to get abducted and taken to Bagram Air Force Base and tortured. Now, that's not going to happen. But at the same time, it's not entirely unreasonable that Fawzia is a little bit worried about what the US government might do. So she's making me fly all the way to Dubai to meet her so we can go on the same plane. But she'll be all right. But it's incredibly important that we get Fawzia in to see Aafia, because seeing her, this is the hero of this whole piece, right? I've said this a few times, but next time I'm locked up as a prisoner in Guantanamo Bay, I want her as my sister, because she's done more for her sister than any other family. Come on, let's give her a little, So we need to do the human bit. We need you people to write to Aafia. Why not? What excuse do you have not to write a letter to Aafia? When I told Aafia that she was a legend in Pakistan, that was the thing I said that had the most impact. because she thought she'd been forgotten by you lot. And so we need to prove that, and you need to write to her, and you send me the letters, I'll get them in through legal mail, and so we can encourage her. So we've got to look at this on a human level, but then we've got to look at it on a practical level. How many of you have read Donald Trump's book, The Art of the Deal? I hope you haven't, it's total nonsense. But you do, when you're doing these things, you have to cut a deal. That's the way it works with the Americans. And so we've got to do something that satisfies them in order to get Aafia out. There are various things we can do with all of my Guantanamo clients, including this very, very dangerous, threatening person over here. I offered, security arrangements because the Americans, are terrified of Saifullah Paracha, aren't you? And so we would say, look, we're going to guarantee that he's not going to go around killing people, and we'll agree to whatever you want. They don't really mean that because they know they're wrong, but it just allows them to act like they don't have to apologize. So we can do security arrangements, we can do whatever else they want, we don't care. We can promise them that Aafia is not going to go public and talk about anything. Of course we can promise them that, because she's not going to, but she's so traumatized that she couldn't possibly do it. But then there's the really big issue here, which is what's Pakistan going to offer in exchange? And, it shouldn't have to be that way. Justice shouldn't come at a price. But if you don't think it does, you're crazy. So, I've been going around saying they should give the Americans 𝐒𝐚𝐿 Afridi. One of your nutty journalists asked me if I was representing 𝐒𝐚𝐿 Afridi, and this was my secret plan. No, I've never met the guy. I don't know anything about him. I do know this, that if you're dealing with the Democrats in government in the US, you've got to factor in that they're cowards, and they're afraid of the American populace saying they're weak on terror, they're weak on crime, whatever. So you've got to give them a story, and they're not really good at coming up with their own PR. Now, 𝐒𝐚𝐿 Afridi is a perfect person, because much as I disapprove of assassinating anyone, allegedly he was the one who helped us murder bin Laden. So Biden can get up on his podium and say, we got 𝐒𝐚𝐿 Afridi, and that, so that works for the Americans. Now, whether that's something Pakistan's willing to do, I hope it is. I was told by one of my contacts here that there was indeed that deal on the table at one point. Let's hope there will be again. And I've told the Foreign Office that I need to be told what the proposed deal is by May the 29th. So they've only got 3 weeks. And the reason for that is I'm going to Washington after we go to Texas, and I'm going to go meet with the people there. I need to go there with something. It's not like I'm head of the American government or something, but I can talk to them. And we need to take some offer to them, and that's got to come from Pakistan. Now, if they don't like what I'm suggesting, come up with something different. I don't care what it is, as long as it's something realistic that we can then propose to the US. And if they do that, we can work this out. If they don't do that, we can't. So the ball is entirely in the Pakistan government's court. And let me say this, in terms of some of the people here who I know are a teeny bit afraid of her coming back, because who was it who turned her over to the Americans in the first place? We know. We're not out to get these people. Maybe they should be held accountable, but that's not something I'm interested in. I'm interested in getting Aafia back. So we're not here to threaten people with revenge. We're just here to get Aafia home. And we need your help to do that. So that's about where we are. Now, this is the real issue. If you don't do it, because of your religious faith, which I respect immensely, if you don't do it, you go immediately to hell. Isn't that right? I'm only kidding. But if you do the right thing by someone in that position, and it's true of all faiths, that if you help someone in prison, you're helping. It was the words of Jesus, who's a prophet in your faith as well as in the Christian faith. And if you help someone in prison, you're helping me. And that's what this is ultimately all about. And I feel that way. There's nothing better in the world than helping someone who's being trampled on in that way. It's certainly what motivates me. Yep.